Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Today, we're going to finish our conversation around the Enneagram. If you've been with us, we've been on this journey walking through these different triads and understanding what motivates them and also diving into how that interacts with our faithful stewardship. What does it look like for us to approach faithful stewardship based on the Enneagram type that we are personally or that we're in relationship with? And today, we're going to finish that off with the 8, 9, and 1. This is what's commonly called the gut triad. It's motivated by anger. There's a lot of anger in this triad, which is confusing for a lot of people because the 9 in particular, as the peacemaker, is certainly not thought of as an angry person. And the 1 is generally not seen as angry either. And yet anger is definitely part of the expression and the way that these individuals tend to operate and show up. The 8 is much easier to identify. So let's talk about that. Again, this is that same pattern that we see in all the other triads, that there's an outward expression of that core tendency. There's a masking of that core tendency, and then there's an inward focus that we see. And so in the 8, we see an anger that is outward. It's expressed in big personalities and really strong approaches to problems. In the 9, we see that masking, that denying of anger, that shutting it down, pushing it into their gut and making sure it doesn't actually come out. And then in the 1, we see that anger turned inward. It's a self-loathing, a self-judgment, a very ugly thought life towards themselves. And so their anger is very focused on who they are and how they're showing up. And so let's start with the 8 because they're the easiest to identify the anger in. They're also the biggest personality in all of the Enneagram, in my opinion. The 8 is commonly called the challenger or the activist. They are big. I tell all my 8s that I'm friends with, hey, you guys show up as a personality that is 10 times bigger than you think you are. You are way overconfident, way overbearing. You tend to walk into a room and just take control of the conversation and drive. 8s are incredibly valuable in society because they are what ultimately bring change. They fight hard enough, they argue loud enough, they push things forward. And so a lot of times we see 8s in politics because they are driving for change. They want to see something different. They see those problems and they're willing to fight. They run into the problem and they're willing to argue their case. The challenge for 8s is that can actually be really disruptive and destructive, particularly in relationships. So if you are married to an 8, a lot of times that 8 is going to take over, going to run without you, going to make decisions without even consulting you because they are absolutely motivated by this sense of control and they drive. If you are an 8, be aware of that tendency. Be aware of what you tend to do and how you show up in decision making. A lot of times 8s have a hard time collaborating. They don't want to slow down. They don't want to ask questions. They don't want to second guess. They just want to keep moving. And if you are an 8 that is married to really any other Enneagram number, but particularly 9s or 2s or 4s, you can see people shut down and withdraw when the 8 takes over and their voice gets drowned out. And one of the things that's really important for an 8 to understand is when they are in stress, they will move to the 5. What that means is they will get isolated, They will pull themselves out and they will go deep into understanding all the different nuances of whatever problem they're trying to solve. They will research and research and research because they are so desperate to be right, to have all the information as they go into these fights that they're picking. They want to make sure that what they are wielding in their arguments is accurate. And so they'll go deep into that 5 and they'll withdraw from relationship. And a lot of times we'll see 8s end up very angry and lonely. And so we need to be really careful as 8s to not get too deep into that stress response and get further and further in the weeds. And so that is something to really pay attention to, because we can see a lot of times 8s will get spun up in those things and they'll end up spending their time, their resources, really overcommitting themselves in lots of different ways, and their families, in this pursuit of justice or getting something fixed that they see as being just deeply wrong in society. Those kinds of things can really become obsessive for 8s, and their anger and their isolation can leave them in really hard places relationally. What we really want to be moving toward in the 8 is that move towards health, which takes us to the 2. If you remember, the 2 is the helper. The healthy part of the 2 is this selfless, self-sacrificing servant of others. When you couple the passion and the strength of an 8, and you actually aim it in a self-sacrificial servanthood of the 2 in a healthy way, it is one of the most profound and life-changing forces in the world for good. An 8 is an incredible force for good when they are connected to that healthy 2, when they see the goal as helping others, not just winning a fight, or when they see the goal as bringing change that is for the benefit of others rather than for the benefit of themselves or whoever they've identified as the person they're trying to defeat. They can get really, really effective because they know what the arguments are and they're willing to step into the fight. As long as that fight is aimed at helping others, it can change the world. In terms of financial stewardship, as well as stewardship of our time, the biggest challenge for the 8 is making sure they are bringing others into the conversation. So if you are an 8 and you are in a marriage, we want to make sure that your spouse is involved in these decisions, that you are hearing their voice, you're slowing down long enough to ask good questions, inviting them to be part of the decision-making, not just running forward without them. If you are married to an 8, I would encourage you to speak louder. 8s, ironically, are not offended by challenge. They love it. That's what they're all about. But a lot of times they're so powerful and so strong in their personality that people will shrink back. Step up, get more confident in what you want to challenge them on. They actually tend to respect that. And so if you are in a conversation around how you're going to apply God's resources to different decisions that you're making, make sure that that's a collaborative effort. It's one of the healthiest things for an 8 to bring others in, because it will naturally move them towards that too. It will naturally get their attention off of themselves or off of this enemy that they've identified or this problem that they're solving, and it'll turn their attention towards others who they care about, and it'll naturally engage for them that tendency to be a helper rather than a fighter. We also want to make sure that we draw lines ahead of time in terms of how far we will go in supporting and advocating for different things or causes. 8s can get really deep and go way over their skis in terms of overcommitting resources, overcommitting their time, volunteering in every capacity because they want to change the world. But that's not faithful stewardship. Getting to a place where you have spent yourself, spent your family's resources, spent all of your relational capital on these things you're passionate about doesn't actually honor God. We end up way focused on our own agendas and our own passions, and we're willy-nilly just overcommitting and saying yes to things that we're passionate about without taking time to ask the question, what would you have me do, Lord, with these resources that you've given me to manage, with these skills that you've placed in me, with the time that I have? What do you want me to do, rather than just impulsively running at what we want to do? Let's move on to the 9. The 9 is one of my favorite humans on the planet, not just because I'm married to one. My wife is a 9, but also because they tend to embody this ability to see all kinds of perspectives. The 9 is called the Peacemaker traditionally. And the 9 is actually an angry person internally. They stuff it. They are always focused on harmony at all costs. One of their gifts is that they are able to see everyone's perspective. They're able to understand. They ask great questions. They are really focused on keeping everyone in a place of peace and harmony. But a lot of times they will sacrifice their own needs or wants in order to maintain that peace and harmony. And that actually boils their anger. Speaking from a little bit of experience, what the 9 does is stuff and suppress that anger until they can't anymore. And then it comes out in big ways, lots of silent treatments, lots of withdrawal, lots of a tendency to punish. And so the 9s in my life, not just my wife, but other 9s that I'm interacting with, I'm always asking them questions to pull out some of that anger before it gets to that boiling point, reminding them that just expressing what they need or what they want is not actually disrupting harmony. It actually helps maintain that harmony. And so it's really important for 9s to know that they are allowed to want things. They're allowed to need things. They're allowed to express those things. And that is not something they need to be afraid of. Conflict is not a sign of brokenness. It's actually a sign of health when it's done really well. And so we want to encourage 9s to not avoid those conversations and end up allowing this anger that's inside them to fester, because they will mask it, they will shut it down, they will disallow it in themselves in order to keep the peace for everybody else. The 9 will move to a 6 in stress, which means it's the worst part of the 6. It's the anxious part, the over-planning part, the constantly chewing on and stewing on and worrying about things part of the 6. What the 9 does when they can't express those needs and wants and they don't allow themselves to get into healthy conversations is they will internally process those worries in their own mind. They'll tell themselves all the stories of how bad everything could be and what it could turn into. Even in some cases, what it means if they bring up some of these things they're frustrated by. They'll play in their head and rehearse and worry about what that could do to the relationships that they're in. And so the worst part of the 6, that anxious part, is what the 9 will turn to in their stress. And in order for us to really engage the 9 and get them to a place of health, in health, a 9 moves to a 3, which again, the 3 is the achiever. A 9 who is able to express themselves, able to let some of that desire, the wants and the needs and the frustrations out in relationship, they will be incredibly productive. A 9 that is kind of activated and is excited about something will move mountains, will get things done. They are incredible humans all across the board. They're incredible in the way that they care for others and the way they see others' perspective. But when they move towards their 3 in health, they also are incredibly productive and hard workers, and they get a lot done. And so 9s are wonderful, but they are also really difficult to engage and to activate. 9s tend to be very comfortable in solitude, in stillness. They are absolutely happy sitting still and not engaging. And so it does take, in relationships, some wooing, some pulling out. With my wife, I have to kind of challenge her sometimes, like, what's exciting to you? What would you love to see happen for our family, in our church? What are the things you would really get motivated by? Because they need a little bit of activation to turn towards that 3 and actually move and get their energy going in a direction that's productive. Otherwise, they'll stay very inward and they'll stay very isolated. If you're a 9 that's in a marriage, ask your spouse to be asking you questions about what you want, what you need, what it would look like for you to be excited about something, because your brain needs to be reminded that those things are okay, that they're exciting, they're inviting, rather than they're a source of disharmony or conflict. And so give your partner, your spouse, permission to ask those things of you and activate those things in you. If you're married to a 9, be really intentional about engaging them in those questions. Because what can happen with a 9 a lot of times is they will just get rolled over. They will never need anything, never want anything. And so from a financial stewardship standpoint, they will allow other people to make decisions and they'll just go along for the ride. But they'll resent those decisions. They'll be frustrated by those decisions, but they'll never voice those things. And so we want to make sure their voice is heard in the decisions that we're making. One of the most difficult situations is when an 8 is married to a 9, because the 8 has a tendency to steamroll and the 9 has a tendency to allow the steamrolling to happen. And so those kinds of combinations can get really, really difficult from a stewardship standpoint. And so we want to make sure we're inviting that 9 to be part of those conversations, really engaging their needs and their wants. We also want to make sure that they are managing their time well, that they're honoring God with the resource of their time that He has given them. Because a lot of times a 9 can get really slothful, really disengaged and isolated, and they will pull away from the productive things, the ministry opportunities, or the service that God is calling them to, because they will move to a place of just stillness and peace. When they're alone and they're not doing anything, it's peaceful, it's harmony. And so they'll seek that out. What we need to make sure we're reminding 9s of is their time is something, and their effort and their skill is something that God placed in them for a reason as well. And they are supposed to honor Him with those resources. And that actually is what will pull them and draw them to that 3. By definition, if we are reminding them to honor God with the skills that He placed in them, they will start to be active and doing the things, and they will move towards that accomplishment of the 3. Now, the 1 is our last personality type in the Enneagram to talk about, and it is also one of our more complicated ones. The 1 is traditionally called the reformer. A lot of times people refer to the 1 as the perfectionist. I find the perfectionist word has a lot of negative connotation, but it also is actually really helpful because the 1 really is rooted in a lot of judgment. The 1 has a sense of exactly how things should be, and they will want things to be exactly how they should be. And if they're not, then everything is wrong. An unhealthy 1 can be extremely dismissive of all of the good in a situation or in a circumstance because of this one part of it that's not right. And so for the relationships I've been in with 1s, friends of mine that are 1s, I have to remind them that just because this part of the whole isn't quite perfect, that doesn't mean that the whole thing is garbage. That's where a 1 can go very quickly. It's because this part isn't quite right, the whole thing is worthless. The whole thing is broken and not worth saving. They can get really ugly in their judgment. But the thing to remember, again, in that progression, the 8 is that outward voice of anger. The 9 is the suppressed, masked voice of anger. The 1 takes all of that judgment that we're seeing on the outside and think of it as being multiplied by 1,000 on the inside. 1s are extremely self-judgmental. They see themselves as failures. They are constantly telling themselves they're inadequate, they're doing it wrong, they're failing, and they wear themselves down in that constant pursuit of getting things perfect. So if you're seeing or hearing from a 1 you're in relationship with a sense of judgment, recognize what they're telling themselves is so much worse than that. And there's an ability to have compassion on that judgment, to see them and say, gosh, if this is what you're saying about this thing, I can't even imagine what you're saying about yourself. The 1 is incredibly valuable because they can identify the problem before anybody else can. They can see the thing that's wrong with whatever it is you're looking at before you've even had a chance to fully digest it. They know exactly what the issues are. And so they're really helpful in brainstorming solutions because they really can identify the problem. A lot of times when we think of financial stewardship, we tend to think of 1s. 1s will have all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed. They will have every penny accounted for because that's what perfection looks like. They will know exactly how these dollars are spent. They will have very strong opinions about right and wrong ways to spend those resources. But a lot of times that actually can get in the way. That 1 can get really controlling, disruptive to relationship and to creativity and to brainstorming what we could do, should do, might do with God's resources because they've already decided There is a right and wrong. When ones are stressed, they move to the 4. They get very melancholy. They get very emotional towards themselves, very self-loathing, and they can get really dark and move towards isolation. The beautiful thing about the 1 is that when they're healthy, they move to the 7. And again, the 7 is the enthusiast. They run after shiny objects. They get really excited easily about new ideas, new things. And so what we want to do in the 1 is we want to invite them into those brainstorming sessions. We want to move them into what the new could look like, particularly when they are stuck on a problem. So rather than letting them just stew on it's wrong, it's not perfect, so the whole thing's broken, we actually invite them into, I really appreciate that you've seen that. What would it look like for that to be better? How do we move it to perfection? How do we get it to be just amazing? And that actually can start to ignite that 7 in them. That can actually move them towards this experience of excitement about the new and the different. And that needs to happen in the context of faithful stewardship as well. So in a family conversation around God's resources, if the 1 is the one who's in charge of the money, if they are really driving all of the tracking in the organization, which is very common, they can also then end up with a lot of control over the decision making. So inviting the 1 into brainstorming, into bigger ideas, what could we do? What would be fun? What sounds exciting? Can open them up and start to move them more towards that healthy 7. It'll get them away from some of that judgment and loosen some of their control so that there's more of an openness. And I do think part of faithful stewardship, although there is a part of it that is about tracking and understanding and being able to account for what you did with God's resources, there also needs to be an open-handedness and an openness to different, to new. God loves to do new things all the time. And so if we can stay open-handed to it and move the 1 towards that 7, there's adventure, there's excitement connected to it, and we can start to lose some of that stranglehold that's mostly rooted in making sure we get it right, recognizing there's a lot of things we don't know. And so we're open to what God leads us to. We're open to a new idea or a new way of thinking. And so we want to think about that not just in our faithful stewardship around finances, but also our time, our skills. The 1 can get really rigid in how they think about these things, and they tend to be closed off to new ideas or new ways to do it because they've already decided what the right way is to do it. It's the curiosity, the invitation to something that's new and different, rather than arguing right or wrong with them or trying to win that battle. That is a lost cause. What actually will turn them is more of an invitation to a curious conversation around what God might be up to and what it might look like for us to partner with him in that work. And so this is that gut triad, that anger triad. It is a really fascinating one. It's one that I find a lot of my relationships, my friends, particularly in the ministry space, we see a lot of 8s. We also see a lot of 1s. And so it's really interesting how often these particular 3 are in relationship and how those dynamics can really start to become barriers to faithful stewardship. And so I hope this journey across the Enneagram is helpful. Hopefully the gift of the Enneagram is compassion, that you understand the motivation, you understand what's driving that individual, and you can approach them with a little bit more of a sense of patience and understanding and start to invite them to their healthy side rather than fighting them and sending them into that stress response that actually makes it worse and digs them in deeper. I hope that you found some great little nuggets in this conversation that will help you in your relationships and in your faithful stewardship. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you.